Hello, Imara Jones, and welcome to Lives at Stake, a series of monthly discussions about critical issues facing transgender and gender nonconforming people across the United States. Lives at Stake is a co-production of WNYC's The Greene Space and my project Translash. Visit thegreenspace.org and translash.org to follow our work. We are just under 100 days from Election Day, and trans people have about as much at stake on the ballot as any other group in the country, whether it be the 23 legislatures where there's currently anti-trans legislation pending, or at the federal level, the ongoing fight over whether trans people should have equal access to housing, healthcare, school safety, or even military service. The lives of trans people has been politicized. And that's why it may be time for trans people to run for political office like never before. And 39 transgender and gender nonconforming people have decided to do just that this year. Here to unpack issues surrounding the decision by trans people to run for office and the need to do so is Aimee Allison, who is the founder and president of She the People, an organization devoted to encouraging women of color, both cis and trans, to run for political office and win. Caitlin Burns, who is a political writer at Vox and who happens to be a trans woman. Alyssa Crispo, who, if she wins her bid to represent the Bronx's 15th district on the New York City Council, will be the first ever transgender person to hold elective office in New York City's nearly 400-year history. And Philippe Cunningham, who is a member of the Minneapolis City Council and the first ever transgender man to ever win office in the history of the United States. Now, today's program happens to take place on the same day as the funeral for Congressman John Lewis. I had the benefit and the honor of knowing Mr. Lewis for many years, having served as an intern for him, both in Washington, D.C. and Atlanta. And given his many years of support for LGBTQ rights, even long before it was fashionable, I know that today's conversation is one that he would champion. Now, today's show is one where we are continuing to do virtually. The Greene Space is an actual space, and we are coming up soon on the day where we'll be back in the space where you can be there, well, hopefully eventually live. I hope to be there live next month, but eventually live and also virtually. But since we're still a virtual program, we need you to participate and ask our questions virtually. That means using the hashtags Lives at Stake or Translash on almost any social media platform that you can think of. We'll fold those into the program. That includes, of course, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, even YouTube, except for maybe TikTok. No TikTok yet. Speaking of TikTok, of course, we love to begin every single one of our shows with a GIF or a meme, something that has given us pleasure or a chuckle over the past week. I still can't get over last week's assertion by the President of the United States that his genius status is proved by the fact that he could recite in order person, woman, man, camera, TV. So those are the memes that I wanted to choose and focus on this week. Of course, the first here is Dora Explorer, who is out, I guess giving the president an assist with this particular tutorial. I remember Dora gave a lot of tutorials to my 3-year-old cousin when she was that age, so I don't know, maybe that's appropriate. But the one that takes the cake for me is Sarah Cooper, who of course is a master at mimicking Donald Trump and embodying him, I guess. And in this one, of course, she puts up a graph of person, woman, man, camera, TV. Maybe he used this as a cheat sheet. I don't know, to prove his status. Before we move to the heart of our program, I wanted to let everyone know that we have exciting news. Next month on Thursday, August the 20th, we'll be launching the Translash podcast. So make sure that you go to www.translash.org to sign up for our newsletter to figure out how you can subscribe to our podcast. I'm thrilled that we're launching this new platform and this new content vertical to reach millions of people with trans stories and trans news. So this is going to be an exciting journey, and come along the ride with me. Now, excuse me, now on, I'm so excited. Now on to the heart of our program. Our first guest today is Aimee Allison. Aimee is the founder and president of She the People, an organization that is devoted to getting women of color, including those who are cis and trans, elected to political office. Aimee is also the former president of Democracy in Color and the host of the Democracy in Color podcast. Aimee is also a fitness queen for real. So if you have other questions outside of politics that deal with, I don't know, weight training or cardio or endurance, I'm sure that she can handle those as well. But whatever it is, Aimee is a powerhouse, and we are thrilled to be joined by Aimee now. Aimee, thank you so much for joining tonight.
Thanks for having me, Imara.
Did you power lift today? Did you power lift today?
No, this is my goal, 100 push-ups a day. I can't do them all at one time, but since I have no access to my gym, that's how I'm started staying in touch with my, I'm 50, so it's not like, it takes work. So you got every day to do something.
Yeah, and every time you say that you're 50, I don't believe it.
Yeah, we got to stay strong, especially because we're so close to this big election. We got to have an outlet for ourselves, to feel like we're personally strong, and also we're strong enough to face the moment. So that's why I lift.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Well, you gave us a great lead-in. What right now, before we turn to some of the granular issues that are really important, what in your mind is the state of play of the election right now? Kind of where are we in this moment?
Well, we're 95 days out. Joe Biden's our nominee. So we started out with one of the most diverse set of candidates in the primary for president. And we have Joe Biden, who's not even the most progressive, but he's going to announce his VP pick. And we've been spending a lot of time really opening up the political imagination of the American people and saying what women of color should be VP on the top of the ticket. And now there are Black women, other women of color who are being vetted. And we'll see in just a few days, next week, who's going to run alongside Joe Biden. The reason it's important is because we did a series of listening sessions. It included trans women from battleground states, because we got to win remember, Hillary Clinton, if we look back to 2016, won the popular vote. That's not what's at issue for 2020. What's at issue is that in certain key states where people of color are the majority, women of color are the key, that places like Arizona and Texas, Georgia and Florida, we need high vote turnout. So we did a series of listening sessions over the last few weeks, and we heard loud and clear that there's an enthusiasm gap amongst women of color who are the most likely Democrats in the core of the multiracial coalition. And so we got to have something to work with. The thing to work with, we believe, is a Black woman on the ticket. So that's where we're at. And today was the day that Trump floated on Twitter that he, hey, should we move election day? He's been saying, hey, vote by mail is vote fraud, which we know is not true. So he's a real threat. And that's where we stand right now. 150,000 people have died from COVID and record unemployment. It's just a big mess. And with 95 days, women of color are going to be the key to making sure that we can get out of the mess that we're in right now.
Right. One of the things that you've said consistently is that She the People is about creating a vision of politics and a vision of the world that doesn't really exist yet. And within that, you have, quite frankly, a theory, a change of the way in which women of color, cis, trans, of all backgrounds, have a role in bringing that about. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because I think, your theory of change, as you've gone along, has actually been proved out.
I mean, we're going to only be able to do this together. It's funny, and when we've talked, and I talk about the term women of color is not a racial identity or anything like that. We have our own identities and communities and nationalities. Mm-hmm. What women of color is a term of solidarity. And we are exercising and lifting up a term of solidarity, which includes everyone, including trans women, including young women, including women who were born in other countries, including Muslim women. And we're looking around to make sure that everyone is here in building a solidarity that's true. And we find ourselves organizing around politics in a common belief on some values. So the theory of change is we don't have to agree about 100% of the things, but we're only good enough as a coalition and in solidarity when everyone is here, everyone is present. And so part of that is from the very beginning of She the People, we have to have the voices of trans women at the table. And I remember when we launched She the People in 2018, we had Ashley Marie Preston, who at the time was an activist. She had been articulating some of the most profound and important justice issues, economic, racial justice, social justice, gender justice, and was running for California State Assembly at the time. And she was on the stage along with Rashida Tlaib, along with Dolores Huerta and others, holding a space for justice. And for I say, we're founded, the politics we haven't seen is a politics fully expressed in a set of shared values. I mean, to love our own and others, to ensure justice is the law of the land, to build a country in which everyone belongs, and to make this American democracy live up to its greatest potential. If we can come together in that grounding politics based in love, that's something we haven't seen. That's transformation. And it means that everyone is at the table holding, and I would say especially and centrally trans women, holding the important issues of racial, economic, and gender justice issues at the center of how we move forward. And holding that vision is, that's the politics we haven't yet seen, that I believe in deeply, but it's like a faith, it's like a religion. And that we haven't, you have to believe and act in a way that we can help bring it to be. And that's what the work of She the People has been about for me.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things I think is that since the founding in 2018, as you said, you involved Ashley Marie Preston, who I think probably was running for office at that time, maybe a little earlier in the state legislature in California. I mean, one of the things that you have been really intent in your political vision from the beginning is including trans women of color. And it's unique in terms of political effort. I can't really think of any other political effort or organization that's been so intentful about doing that. And I'm wondering what led you to do that. I mean, you kind of alluded to it in what you just said, but I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about why you think that's so central.
Well, the idea of an intersectional way of thinking about that we're enough, that our experiences, our view, our perspectives uniquely qualify us to lead, includes the very powerful and important experience perspectives of trans women. And trans women are women, and we are also very complex. The thing about Ashley Marie Preston, which is so interesting, is remember, Caitlyn Jenner was, coming on the scene, being outspoken. Ashley Marie Preston said no, called out Caitlyn Jenner around issues of racial justice. Mm-hmm. And we have to have the complexity to be able to hold that. I mean, I wanted to make sure that we, when we talk about justice issues, that mm-hmm. That's the complexity that all of our identities stack up. So it's not simply being trans. It's also that Ashley was also Black woman, also an advocate for working people, and like all of these things make her an excellent leader. And we can look across the country at those who are embracing a justice agenda, those whose personal experience of being excluded, people who have felt the pain of public policy or practice that has excluded people from fully being able to express themselves or enjoy the rights that other Americans enjoy. And these are the people who are closest to the pain and therefore closest to the solutions. And that's why She the People explicitly, if there's not a trans woman in the House, we aren't having a full view of the possibility for translating our view of justice into reality, into politics, into government, into governing. And that's fundamental for how we're organized.
Yeah, I think, the phrase that you use, we are enough, our experiences are enough, they're valid, they deserve to be heard and seen in the political process, that's a radical vision for women overall, is that everyone's worthy and should be brought in, I think is really, really powerful in this moment. So I'm wondering what advice you have to trans women of color, in this case, who are thinking about running for office. What are the invites and the insights that you think are really important, and where would you start in order, if you wanted to run for office, as a resource?
First, I will say that there are, we have such a deep bench of leadership, and often we need to be asked so many times to run for office, and we want to feel like we're ready. So there are networks that we should be tapping into that offer preparation, network support, planning to run for office at every level. Because we often focus, this year we're talking a lot about the president, the White House, we're talking about the Senate, but really a lot of the actions in the state legislatures, in county seats, city councils, the whole fight over public dollars being transitioned from police departments into other kinds of social safety nets, mental health or affordable, those are local fights. And so who runs for school board, city council, state ledge, that's going to have the biggest impact on, like, a defund the police, like the being able to translate that into public policy and budgets. Yeah. So my sense of it is, take a look at where it is possible to, like, emerge. Emerge America is a training program that's a six-month long program for potential people who want to prepare to be candidates. And 24 states have Emerge programs, and there have been trans women who have successfully, especially trans women of color, who I'm trying to watch and make sure that we have a space for. The new leader, Ashanti Golar of Emerge America.
Oh, yeah.
Wonderful Black woman, and this is our shared philosophy. So Emerge is one place to get training. I will also say that She the People had the honor of including you, Imara, in, we looked around the country and we said, who are the 20 women of color to watch who are creating the platform, the network, the support? It's you. You're named there. You were featured in Elle magazine, and I think joining a network of supportive people who understand the power, who are willing to write checks, who will give, I believe we need to have national visibility even for local candidates. And, the most important advice that I have given to candidates running at every level is to know whose water you're carrying. Why are you doing it? Ask yourself three things. Are you the right person? Is it the right time? And is it the right job? And who are you in this fight for? And then surround yourself with people who love you no matter what. Public service is not meant to be all the time, forever thing. But when we're called for public service, know that She the People, we want to know who, the women who are stepping forward, and we want to give lift and support for everyone who's answering a call in this moment.
Wow. Well, Aimee, thank you so much for joining us tonight, for taking out the time during an incredibly busy time during this election cycle. I honestly believe that when the history of this political era is written, that your work and that She the People will be a part of the discourse of what helped us bridge to a new America and a new politics. And you are absolutely a visionary. And this is something that you held to your heart long before you were able to manifest it. And you have brought it into being and continue to lead it. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. And you're going to make me cry. I so appreciate being included in this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, that was the one, the only Aimee Allison doing 100 push-ups a day. who is the founder and president of She the People, an organization devoted to encouraging women of color to run and win, who are both cis and trans, as well as encouraging the leadership of women of color at the local level. Thank you so much, Aimee. And we are moving on to our next guest. You are watching Lives at Stake, a series of monthly discussions about critical issues facing trans and gender nonconforming communities across the United States. I'm Imara Jones. Well, our next guest is Caitlin Burns, who is a political writer at Vox and also a veteran, smart, incisive trans woman who has worked in politics for a really long time in terms of covering it. We are now turning to Caitlin to get her insights about this year and what it means for trans people. Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm wondering, when you look out through the lens that you have, which is really unique in terms of reporters and who have this deep knowledge of politics, just the raw politics of the way it works, from Capitol Hill to electoral to legislatures, and also happen to be trans. When you're looking out across the landscape this year, I'm wondering, what are some of the things that strike you about what's happening in the country and why it may be really important for trans people to run in this moment?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at every level of government, there are fights over trans rights, basically. So, you know, if you look in Congress today, they are fighting over the Equality Act. There was just today, there was a letter sent from over 100 legislators to HUD Secretary Ben Carson over the homeless shelter rule, which is really maybe the most hideous policy proposal that we've seen from the Trump administration. You know, state legislators, you have conservative governments trying to ban, you know, trans kids from accessing puberty blockers and basic trans health care. And then all the way down to the school board level. I mean, school boards are arguably the most important place for trans policymakers right now, or trans allies who are policymakers, because they're the ones who are writing the school policies, the bathroom policies, the school sports policies. If you're running for school board or you're on a school board right now, you will have impact on trans people's lives. So it's really important that trans people get their voices heard in as many ways as possible in these processes. And the most direct way to exercise that power is to just get elected and have a vote yourself. But as you know, we are still disproportionately not represented at all levels of government.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that one of the things that I've heard you say before is that at this time when there's all this activity that you're talking about, from the local level to the national level, that it's really important, just from a public and discourse and a democracy point of view, for trans people to be a part of that conversation. One of the things that we've spoken about, or that we spoke about, you and I, is that there are these different methods for trans people to win, and they're kind of models. There's kind of a Donna Carone model, who is the first trans person that we know of ever elected to a state legislature in the United States. There's an Andrea Jenkins model, which is very different. Also the first Black person, Black trans woman to be elected to political office in the United States. And also Philippe as well. Like, those are kind of three different ways of getting elected to office. I'm wondering if we can talk about that. But before we move to that, actually, it just occurred to me, speaking of Danica's name, I mean, one of the things that you've mentioned is that an example of why it's important to have trans people in politics is what Danica did when there was these anti-trans proposals in Virginia, and how she, just through her voice, was able to turn the tide. So I'm wondering if we can just give that example of why it's important, for what happens when a trans person is in politics and these discussions happen.
Yeah. So I unabashedly love Danica Rome. I am not afraid to admit that. I have a lot of admiration for her just as a policymaker, and also she's a former journalist. So, you know, once a journalist, kind of always a journalist, even though she kind of went to the dark side. We still love her for her journalism past, but I've interviewed her now probably half a dozen times, and you know, once you get past her usual speech about Route 28, which she always leads every answer with, which we'll get to that later.
Yeah.
She'll tell you that it really does make a big difference for trans people to be in the room when these policies are being discussed. And it really does make a difference when it's a trans person who is the elected official and not just a staffer. Staffers obviously have, you know, a lot of power in that they can influence written policy, but at the end of the day, it's not the staffer that gets up and makes the floor speech. It's the policymaker. So if you look back this last legislative session, there was the LGBT civil rights bill that they passed in Virginia, and I have to go back and double check, but I think Danica was a co-sponsor, but I'm not sure if she actually wrote the bill. But when it came time to pass it, she stood up and gave the most amazing, affirming floor speech for trans rights that I've ever seen. And the fact of the matter is, you know, cis lawmakers don't understand what it's like to grow up trans. They don't know what it's like to have to go to school with gender dysphoria and to try to get an education while you're also dealing with, you know, the dysphoria and the distress that causes. And you could really feel it come through in her floor speech that I thought was just remarkable. And, you know, those are the things, the little added value that trans elected officials bring to the table when we're talking about these issues.
Yeah, I think that's right. So can you take us through what are the models for trans people running? As we said, there's a kind of a Danica way, and there's a Andrea Jenkins way, who we'll be talking to in a later. I'll have a secret announcement about that, but Andrea Jenkins, and then also Philippe Cunningham. I too, honestly, I probably have heard the Route 28 speech twice, so I am very, very, very familiar with the importance of that road, and I think widening that road, I think, is really important to our district. But what are the three kind of ways that we've seen so far that trans people are able to win?
Yeah, before we get into the way they've won, let's look back in the way that they've lost in the past. So typically in the past, until Danica Rome's election, you would have these trans people, and most of the time it was wealthier, white trans women who were sort of running vanity campaigns. You know, a lot of them didn't necessarily come with a lot of political experience to begin with. And they got into races that were just kind of marginal to begin with. And what happened is they would run and they'd get a bunch of headlines as the trans candidate. But that's not really a winning formula. Like you get headlines, yes, but you can't run a campaign based entirely on your identity. And it was really frustrating to watch from a distance, because it's like, okay, you're not going to break out of this sort of media narrative unless you do something extreme. And I think that's where Danica came in. As you noted earlier, she was the first openly trans state legislator elected to office. She also got the headline saying trans candidate, you know, quote unquote. But the difference was, again, Route 28, she led with that every time. Like when she went out and talked to her potential voters, they said, you got to fix this road. It's killing my commute. So every time she was interviewed, she led with Route 28. So yes, she was the trans candidate, but to the local people, she was the Route 28 candidate. And this is like their biggest headache every day. Of course, they're going to vote for her. And then she's running against this guy who's trying to attack her based on her gender identity, where, you know, they're misgendering her and all the literature, you know, just huge disrespect. This guy has a long record of just a homophobic bill after homophobic bill. And she cleans his clock, honestly. So it was really exciting to see her come along and sort of break that mold for trans candidates. And you've seen a few now sort of borrow that to get elected. Brianna Titone in Colorado was the first openly trans state legislator in that state. And she ran a very similar campaign in an even more conservative district. And she's now actually running for re-election this year. She is the #1 target of Republicans in that state. So that's another race that I'm sort of watching really closely. But you mentioned Andrea Jenkins in Minnesota. So she was different from Danica, but also different from the previous folks who ran for office. Now, she was running for city council, which is slightly different from state rep, but you know, Minneapolis is a big city, so I wouldn't be surprised if she represents just as many people as Danica does. I'd have to look that up. But, you know, she has a very long history as a community organizer in Minneapolis. You know, she strikes me as somebody who people have known for a long time, and she's been doing work in the background. And then when the seat opened up, she saw an opportunity. I thought she played it very skillfully politically, where she got in the race and sort of elbowed out her potential primary challengers, and then won the district. I mean, once you win the primary in some of these, you know, inner city districts as a Democrat, it's fairly straightforward to beat the Republican. And I think Philippe is somewhat similar. I do not live in Minnesota, so I don't know for sure.
Right.
But from what I've heard, Philippe, and you can maybe ask him this later, really pounded the pavement in his campaign. And if I remember correctly, he won because of the ranked choice voting that Minneapolis uses. So he had a very tight race. And pulled it out at the end, became the first trans man, openly trans man, to get elected to office in the country, and obviously the first Black trans man as well. And yeah, I'm just super impressed with both of them up there in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting because they both won in the same year, right? So I think that's interesting. But yeah, it's those three ways, right? So you have Danica, who's like, you know, one issue, but that issue that is paramount in her district and just willing to talk to anybody, anywhere, at any time about it, no matter what. And then Andrea, you know, this combination of community organizing, and as you said, just being really smart about elbowing out other ways, but, you know, Andrea being really rooted in the community. And then Philippe, you know, similarly, but also came from this like policy background within Minneapolis and within the mayor's office, so it was already kind of a part of the political conversation there already. And so those are kind of the ways that trans people have overcome various ways. I wanted to ask, when you look out on the landscape, this moment of intensity where we have trans people getting elected to office, where we have, you know, 39 people, 25 still left running for office at all levels across the country. That's one part that's happening. These groundbreaking people, Danica, Andrea, Philippe. And then also at the same time, having, you know, a record number of anti-trans bills at the state level, and having, you know, these really intense conversations at the federal level over basic rights for trans people. When you look out on that landscape, are you hopeful or not, cautiously optimistic? How would you say that when you look out on what's happening, what's your takeaway?
If you had asked me this question a month ago, I think I'd have a different answer, to be honest with you. So from a policy perspective, looking at it nationally, I'm pretty optimistic. A lot of it hinges on the presidential election. So one of the sort of silver linings of the Trump administration is that they didn't pass anti-trans legislation, which is difficult to undo. Nearly every policy that the Trump administration has put into place that hurts trans people has been just an administration policy. So what that means is if, let's say, Donald Trump loses this fall, the next president, in this case Biden, could come in and just undo all of the rules that Trump did. So, that's one good thing. The other sort of part that I'm optimistic about is the Senate. If Democrats can take the Senate with, I think, a 3 or 4 vote majority, I think they'll be able to pass the Equality Act, which will actually, in and of itself, wipe out a lot of these, Trump administration rules over the last couple of years. So it is, I am optimistic. I think the biggest sort of bullet that we dodged politically was the Supreme Court case, Bostock v. Clayton County, where I don't think anybody was expecting us to win that one, and we did. And that is going to give us sort of a legal backbone, even if Trump is reelected this year, to be able to sort of fight back and challenge a lot of these rules. On the state level, it's really interesting to watch conservatives evolve on this issue. So a couple of years ago, it was all about bathroom bills, and they were pushing really hard to pass these bathroom bills, which affect, all trans people. If you've noticed, their focus is getting smaller and smaller over time. So they're not really pushing bathroom bills anymore. Like, they've figured out that those aren't going to pass. Like, they can't win that policy fight. Instead, what you're seeing is they're focusing on the trans kids. They're trying to ban puberty blockers. They're trying to ban trans women for women's sports. These are still important issues, but they're not hitting as much of the trans community at a time. And even then, they're not finding any success. Like, none of these bills are actually passing, except for the 2 in Idaho.
Yeah.
The rest of the country has struck out. And I think it's really telling that in the year of coronavirus, the number one healthcare priority of the GOP coming into the year was stopping trans kids from being able to transition. And then all of a sudden we got hit with this, this massive pandemic. It's like, thanks a lot. You could have gotten ready for it. Instead, you just wanted to dunk on the queer kids. And it's just ridiculous. I think people are starting to look through this. The conservative media puts up a big fight over trans issues, but I don't honestly think they're winning the argument at this point.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens, and hopefully your optimism will hold throughout the season. I really want to thank you for joining us, and it's quite clear from the depth of your knowledge that everyone should be following you on all of the social media, specifically on Twitter, where I think you're transcribed, and also at Vox, where people can sign up for their newsletter and read your work on a regular basis. I want to thank you so much for being on tonight, and I hope that you'll be able to come back.
Thank you. Have me on anytime.
Of course. That is Caitlin Burns, who is a political writer at Vox, who is also a trans woman, and who knows, as we know, a whole bunch about trans politics in America right now. You are watching Lives at Stake. I am Imara Jones. Make sure that you continue to use the hashtags Live at Stake and Translash as you put up your comments. Speaking of which, we had a comment from Jordan Reichenbach, who said that this conversation underscores that we have to control the conversation for ourselves, and that we have to make sure that we are involved in this process. So I want to thank them for that comment. We also come to the point in our program where we also wanted to just underscore that this program is free for everybody, but it's not free to produce. So we want you to look in our feeds right now for the text to donate information so that you can give to make sure that we can continue to bring you this really important program each month, and are grateful for whatever you might give. Now, for a local take on all of this, and a very exciting local take on this particular issue, we're now turning our conversation to Alyssa Crispo, who is running to represent the Bronx, I believe the 15th district, on the New York City Council. If she is elected, she will be the first trans person elected to political office in the nearly 400-year history of New York City. Currently, she is an education liaison in the Bronx Borough President's Office. Alyssa, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Imara, for having me.
Thank you, and congratulations on the beginning of your race and your bid. I'm wondering, just before we kind of turn to issues that I know that are going to be near and dear to your heart because you're running to focus on a very specific area, I'm wondering if it occurred to you beforehand, or if it shocked you when you learned that no other trans person had ever been elected to office in New York City since, the 1600s.
It is quite shocking, to be honest with you, that Minnesota and Virginia and Colorado have beat us to the punch in that sense. New York City is seen as this progressive beacon and this place that is accepting and diverse and inclusive. And for the most part it is, but in politics, up until relatively recently, our politics have been, more on the moderate side.
Yeah. What is the thing that made you decide to run, when you just said, you know what, I have to get in this race, and this is the reason why I have to get in this race? What was that moment for you? I think it's important for people to understand that if they have similar notions, similar feelings, these similar issues, that they should get involved. So can you just talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So first of all, I strongly believe that those of us who have suffered the most and who have been oppressed and marginalized and who have been pushed to the outskirts of the outskirts are the ones who have the solutions, and ultimately the ones who should be sitting at the decision-making table. For me, I had been juggling with the idea of running for office since I decided that this is what I wanted to do back in 2016 when Bernie Sanders was a presidential candidate, and I realized that this is what I was passionate about. But I had always talked myself out of it because I thought, for one, maybe the Bronx is not ready. The Bronx to some people is not the most progressive borough in New York City. And I was my own worst critic. I was saying to myself, well, you're a former sex worker. You are somebody who was formerly incarcerated for a very short period of time, but nevertheless formerly incarcerated for sex working. And I didn't think that folks would be ready for that. However, as I started to be more secure and more comfortable in my skin and who I am, I had this epiphany, and I said to myself, well, you know what? All of those things that you thought people were not going to support you for or connect with or relate to actually make for a really unique and compelling story. And that is actually what people will be able to relate to you for. And so when I was able to start changing the way of thinking and being more confident in telling myself, you are qualified, you can do this, you know how these things work, that's when ultimately I decided I'm throwing my name in this, and here I am.
What is it that you think that your district needs the most, and what are you most passionate about in your campaign? I think you already gave us a rationale for why you, which I think is really powerful, which is that, people who are marginalized need to be at the center of the conversation, and now decision makers. Of course, we've seen so many statistics related to COVID that the Bronx remains, sadly, the most marginalized place in New York City, and using some indicators, the most in the nation. So I'm wondering specifically, what is the thing that you want to do and focus on in your campaign and as city council member?
Well, I would say that there's two things. One would be jobs, economic justice, workforce development. This is a district where 70% of the people who live here are unemployed. This is a district where 36% of the people have less than a high school diploma. The other thing would be affordable housing. The rent in New York City is just sky high. It's too damn high, as they say. And there's 41% of people in my district who are severely rent burdened, which means that many of them are paying up to 50% of their income on their rent. And so that's unacceptable. Notwithstanding, the Bronx is last in many things. The Bronx is the hungriest, unhealthiest borough in all of New York City. And so when you see these facts and you start to learn them, you can't just sit by idle and do nothing. You have to do something about it.
Yeah. If elected, you'll be called upon, you'll have a unique role in the history of New York City and the history of New York State. I haven't quite checked this, but I would be surprised if you wouldn't be the first Latinx trans person to be elected to office in the United States. If that happens, there'll be also calls beyond focusing on these local issues. Like for you, your Route 28 that Danica Roem focuses on is housing and workforce development. So beyond those aside, you'll also be asked to do things that focus on the broader issue of trans women in society. And with that in mind, I'm wondering how it strikes you that there was, of course, a trans woman murdered, Tiffany Harris, in the Bronx earlier this week, and how that strikes you. I know that she was murdered outside of your district. It wouldn't be where you would represent, but still, I'm just wondering how that strikes you, and that idea of also having a platform to speak out about these other issues.
Look, I think as one of the first trans women of color, and as you say, one of the first Latinx trans women of color to run for public office in New York City, it's incumbent upon me to speak up and speak out about these issues. Folks in politics will tell you that you cannot focus on your identity because you won't win. And to a certain degree, they're right. But at the same time, it's very challenging because you have to find the right balance, right? There's a lot of pressure from the community to support and speak out and use your platform to speak justice. At the same time, it feels as though you've got, political consultants and stuff telling you, well, you can't speak too much to that because it's not a winning message. And so there are times when you're too trans and times when you're not trans enough. But for me personally, I'll just say that I don't run away from the fact that I'm trans. I'm not running because I'm trans. I just happen to be a candidate who is trans. And I tell people all the time, do not support me simply because I'm trans. Support me because I'm a working class Latina who came from nothing, who lived in public housing and on Medicaid and food stamps. And I worked my way here to where I am. But yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to run as a trans candidate of color in a community where arguably the LGBTQ movement was started by trans women of color, and they're always there to tell you, don't you forget where you came from, don't you forget who your ancestors are and the shoulders that you stand on. And I don't.
Yeah. That phrase that you use, sometimes you're too trans, sometimes you're not trans enough, I think is a really powerful one. Lastly, someone in our audience asked, and I think this is really important, they identify themselves as a trans, not trans, but a trans ally, Brian Romero, and he asked, what can people do to support trans candidates? So can you just tell us in our last question, kind of what can people do to support you and candidates who are also trans overall?
Well, we always need financial help. One of the worst things about running for office is that you got to raise money. Otherwise, it's virtually impossible. And so for one, they could put their money where their mouth is and they can support us and they can donate to our campaigns. They can also use platforms like yours to amplify us and uplift us and give us the opportunity to share our message. So those are two ways I think that folks can help trans people running for office.
Yeah, and then they can do all that and tell their friends and other people that they should do the same, right? Who you are and what you're running for and why it's important for them to support you. Well, I really want to thank you for joining us tonight. I think ending on the note of putting your money where your mouth is in terms of supporting trans rights and trans candidates is a great place for us to put a pin in our conversation. I hope that we can have you back. And I know that I speak for everyone when we wish you all the best on the campaign trail, both in terms of staying safe and being able to get your message out to people in your district about who you are and why you're running.
Thank you so much, Imara.
Thank you so much. That is Alyssa Crispo, who is currently an education liaison in the office of the Bronx Borough President, and now a candidate for Bronx's 15th district, a seat on the New York City Council. If she wins, she will be the first transgender person elected to office in the history of New York City. I can't believe it every time I say it. I just can't. Last but certainly not least tonight is Philippe Cunningham. Philippe Cunningham is now where Alyssa wants to be, right? On a seat on the city council, which is why we wanted to end tonight with a conversation with Philippe. What can Alyssa kind of expect when she gets there? Philippe Cunningham is a city council member in Minneapolis and is also the first open transgender man of color to win elective office in the history of the United States. Thank you, Philippe, for joining us tonight. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I am hanging in there. Lots going on.
Listen, to be hanging in there, I mean, you're looking kind of fresh. Did you just come out of the shower or something? I mean,
I just wake up like this.
Well done, well done. I mean, you know, the coordinating jacket and it's got a little sheen to it. I mean, well done, you.
I mean, I have to step my game up. You're gorgeous, and so I had to make sure I was on point. So thank you.
Thank you. When you were on the Obama town hall where Representative John Lewis was on as well, may he rest in peace, you know, you looked very serious. You were in a suit and very buttoned up. So this is a different, you got different notes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us. So we could do this all night, but on to business.
Yes.
As you are, I want to talk to you about many things. Specifically, I want to get into a little bit for what can a person like Elisa expect when they win city council office, and to talk more about, you know, what we teed up earlier, which is how you won your race. Like, what did you run on and how did you win? But because you represent Minneapolis and there have been so many changes there, I wanted to just get a sense from you of where you think your city is right now. And also, you've been really intent on trying to clear up a misconception about what everyone else calls defunding the police, and this idea that in Minneapolis, in response to the terrible murder of George Floyd, that, you know, the city has voted and that you and your colleagues voted to eliminate police and to do away with policing. So where's your city and what's that misconception?
Yeah, so first off, I'll just say that people sleep on Minneapolis as a progressive city. You know, the idea of, you know, it's surprising that Minneapolis beat New York in terms of having elected trans folks. Minnesota's a flyover state. You know, it's like folks go from coast to coast and they fly right over Minnesota and don't think of us as a space for such a liberal city. I just have to point out to folks, there are 2 out Black trans folks elected to office in the United States. Both of us were elected to the Minneapolis City Council at the same time. So I think that just really gives an idea of the political leanings of Minneapolis. You know, when I ran for office, I ran on a platform of building intergenerational prosperity and peace. So really focusing on how are we disrupting cycles of intergenerational poverty and violence, and had a very clear vision of how do we achieve that. I ran against a 20-year city council president incumbent whose mother held the seat before her for 24 years and was the city council president as well. And another family member held the seat before her for, I believe, 7 years. So I was definitely the underdog in the election, but I came with a clear vision. And because of ranked choice voting, which I know you all are rolling out in New York City, I was able to come fully authentically as myself. I was in no way shy about the fact that I'm trans, that I'm married to a man who is also trans, like all of those things. I was in my politics, I ran to do the work that I'm doing right now, which is to build new systems of public safety. And so I was able to say from the very beginning what I was going to be doing and how I was going to be showing up. And that's what I was elected to do. So to kind of clarify or explain a little bit, right now what we're really doing is focusing on reimagining public safety. So what that means is how are we unrooting public safety that has a history and presence in white supremacy, and instead is built on community justice and the public health approach to public safety, which is a clear framework. We're not starting from scratch. And so that is really, it's really nuanced. And, you know, a phrase like defund the police does not accurately capture the level of detail that goes into the work of reimagining public safety.
Right. What has been your experience after you got elected? You ran that race, you had a very clear, you were giving people a very clear idea of what they were getting when they voted for you issue-wise, which is just great for politicians to do overall. What has been your biggest surprise as you joined City Council? What's been your experience? How does transness intersect with that, if at all?
I mean, I exist as a trans person. And so therefore, you know, one of the things that I think that folks don't recognize about trans folks is that we have a true asset, having lived multiple lived experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So prior to transitioning, I know this is probably pretty surprising, but I was a high femme woman. And so I lived my life as a high femme Black woman. And then I transitioned and now live my life being perceived as a cis gay Black man. So I have multiple lived experiences of marginalization and oppression. So when I analyze policies, I'm doing it from multiple lived perspectives. That is an asset that is so deeply underappreciated about trans folks that we bring to the table. So that's how my transness shows up, as well as being intentional about bringing an intersectional analysis as well to public policy in the policymaking process. I would say that the thing that I have found the most surprising as a city council member has been the level, the scale. Now, I can't even imagine New York, so God bless y'all. The scale of both negative and positive input that comes from the work and being a public figure, which was I'm a nerd. I like the policy. I'm a wonk. So being used to being very public is a new experience for sure that takes some time to get used to.
Wow, yeah, it sounds, you know, if you're a nerd and you're a policy person beforehand, there may be a little bit of an introvert, so I can imagine it's a crush to be in the public eye all the time. Speaking of which, you know, I don't know how long you wish to have a political career. I hope that this is just the beginning, because for all the reasons that you said, it's really important for trans people to be a part of the political discourse. But I'm wondering, whenever you decide to exit politics, what do you think you want to be remembered for?
I love that question. I'll just say first, I have no idea what my political career looks like right now. I love the work that I do. In Minneapolis, we have a council strong system, which means that we are very unique in that we have a lot of power as city council members. And so right now I have the ability to implement policy, to be able to implement initiatives and various change efforts that I can see within a year actually impacting and bettering the lives of my neighbors. I wouldn't be able to do that as mayor. I wouldn't be able to do that on the state level or in Congress, like where I'm actually seeing the people that I love in my beloved community, actually their lives improve directly from the work that I'm doing.
Wow.
So I really love what I'm doing. And so we'll see. But what I want to be remembered for is the fact that I was able to actually lead from my position of power the actual change of building community wealth for the people who already live in our community. So in order for our community to become prosperous, we're not displacing Black and brown folks in order to be able to raise that income level, but the folks who actually live here are experiencing the prosperity, are experiencing the peace and safety of a whole neighborhood. We haven't really seen that done, if at all, in this country. And so that is my mission, is to ensure that the folks who benefit from me being able to access this power are the folks who are currently my neighbors, who have lived here for generations, and who have been left out and left behind historically.
Well, thank you so much for that vision and for your work and for your leadership. I think you've underscored why it's really important for trans people to run, because as you say, you actually have a different vision for how the world can work that's informed by your different experiences. And that's something that our country can benefit from. It's what democracy is all about. I know that we all wish you so much more continued success, continued leadership. Look forward to everything that you're going to do. I'm so appreciative that you came on tonight. I know how much you have on your plate, and the fact that you came on looking fresh, I mean, that just adds to it. So thank you very much, Philippe. I really appreciate it. I hope that we can have you back on sometime.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, that is Philippe Cunningham, who is the council member from Minneapolis. And is a history maker in terms of being the first ever trans-masculine person ever elected to office in the history of the United States. So that brings us to the end of our program tonight, Lives at Stake. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that we've been able to answer the essential question that we started out with, which is why trans people should run for office. I think we've been very thorough in covering that our voices and our leadership and our power and our vision mean so much to this moment where we need to find new ways. So go out there and support the 25 remaining trans candidates who are running, and lend them your support, including, and of all political backgrounds, I should say that there's not just Democrats, including the race of our local member here at Alyssa Crispo. Thank you so much for joining us at Lives at Stake. Our next Lives at Stake, I have to look at the roll because we're actually changing the date. Our next Lives at Stake is actually going to be on August the 26th, which is a Wednesday. We normally do Thursday. August 26th, join us here. Then thank you so much. And remember to sign up for the Translash newsletter to get news on our new podcast. Have an incredible evening, and we'll see you next month.